In section 9.6, we continue to look at factoring trinomials, but now we have a leading coefficient other than 1. Makes life a little more complicated here, but we're in luck because somebody, not I, but somebody has figured out a nice little slick system for helping us here. So here we have 7x squared plus 30x plus 8, and we want to try to factor that. And we're going to use the x again, but now instead of just writing c here, we're going to write the product of a times c. When a was equal to 1, we didn't need to worry about it. But now we need to take 7 times 8 to write 56 here. b still goes here just like it did before. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to 56 and add to 30. So for example, 1 times 56 gives us 56, but they add to 57. 2 times 28 gives us 56. And they added to 30, so that's good. Now, here's the real clever part. So far, that didn't do a whole lot for us. But now what we're going to do is to write our box like we did before, but this time we now know the 4 components of that box, and we're going to try to figure out what binomials give us those 4 components. So we already knew that we would end up with 7x squared and that we would end up with 8. The new information that we get from the x is the x terms. We have a 2x and a 28x. And it doesn't matter where you put the 2. You could switch these 2 around. You'll get the same result. Okay, now the trick is to look across the rows and factor out the greatest common factor in each row. So with 7x squared and 2x, the greatest common factor is x. And with 28x and 8, the greatest common factor for those two terms is 4. Okay, now we look at the columns. So looking at 7x squared and 28x, the greatest common factor, the most that we can factor out of those two terms is 7x. And then for 2x and 8, the greatest common factor is 2. And now we have the two binomials that will give us that trinomial. This is going to give us 7x plus 2 times x plus 4. And if you multiply that out, 7x times x is 7x squared, 7x times 4 is 28x, 2 times x is 2x, and then those are going to combine to give us 30x, and then 2 times 4 is 8, so it checks out. Hey, let's look at another example. So here we have our x all ready to go. Again, we're going to multiply a times c to get 210, and b this time is negative. And because we have a positive product here, we know that both numbers have to have the same sign, so they're both going to be negative in this case. So focus on two numbers that multiply to 210 that add to 41. So for example, 1 times 210, ridiculously large here because those add to 211, not 41. How about 2 times 105? That won't work. 3 times 70, no. 4 won't go into 210, 5 will. 5 times 42, those add up to 47, so we're getting closer. 6 goes into 210, 35 times. Those add up to 41. So we have a negative 6 and a negative 35. Those will multiply to 210 and add to negative 41. So then when we make our box, we now know our x terms. Oops. So we have 7x squared and 30. That came from the original trinomial. And now for our x terms, we have a negative 6x and a 35x. Okay, so looking across the top row, 7x squared, negative 6x, the greatest common factor is x. 35x and 30, the greatest common factor is 5. Now 7x squared and 35x, the greatest common factor is 7x. And negative 6x and 30, the greatest common factor here is 6. We take the sign of the box that's closest to the term we're writing. So because the 6x is a negative 6x here, we need a negative 6 here. And so we end up with 7x minus 6 times x plus 5. Okay, number 3. Here we have c is negative. When we take a times c, so 8 times negative 8, we get a negative 64. It means we're going to have opposite signs. B is 63. So two numbers that multiply to 64 that have a difference of 63, and we got it first try. 1 and 64. And then the larger number, 64, has to have the same sign as B. That means the 1 becomes a negative 1. So negative 1 times 64, negative 64, add them to get 63. So we fill in our box here, and we know from the original trinomial that we have 8x squared, we have a negative 8 here, and now we have a negative 1x, or just negative x, and 64x. So looking across the top row, the greatest common factor is x. Bottom row, the greatest common factor is 8. Again, it's a positive 8 because of this box. Closest to the term we're writing is positive. 8x squared and 64x, we could factor out 8x. Negative x, negative 8, the only thing that will go into both of those is 1, but it's a negative 1 because that x is negative. So we end up with 8x minus 1 times x plus 8. Okay, number 4. So here we have a is negative, and we really don't want that for this method. So I'm going to factor out a negative 1 in order to make that leading coefficient positive. So factor out a negative 1, and that's going to change the sign of all of these terms. So we get 6x squared minus 19x plus 8. So now take a times c. 6 times 8 gives us 48. The value of b is now negative 19. So we have two numbers that are both going to be negative. Multiply to 48, add to 19. So we could take, let's see, 1 times 48, add up to 49. That's not good. 2 times 24, not good. 3 times 16, that works. So we have a negative 3 and a negative 16. So then we make our box, and we have, now look at the trinomial that we get after factoring out the negative 1. So we have 6x squared plus 8 here, and then we have a negative 3x and a negative 16x. Okay, so 6x squared, negative 3x, we can factor out a 3x there, positive because this term is positive. Negative 16x and 8, we can factor out negative 8, negative because the box closest to the term is negative. 6x squared and negative 16x, we can factor out 2x, and then negative 3x and 8 don't have anything in common other than 1, so we have 1, but it's a negative 1. So we end up with 2x minus 1 times 3x minus 8, but then don't forget we have a negative 1 over here that we had factored out. So we can leave it just like this, negative 1 times 2x minus 1 times 3x minus 8. Okay, number 5. Sometimes you'll find that you can factor out some number or term first. So we really don't like maybe working with numbers like 111 and 216, not so pleasant. But you might spot that 3 goes into all three of those numbers. So we can factor out a 3. So 15x squared divided by 3 is 5x squared. 111x divided by 3 is 37x. And then negative 16 divided by 3 is negative 72. So now focus on factoring this trinomial. So 5 times negative 72 gives us negative 360. The value of b is now 37. So the negative product here tells us we have opposite signs, so we want a difference of 37. Now 360 rather has a whole lot of factors to it, so we could take a while doing this. 1 times 360, way too far apart. We want two numbers that are 37 apart. And that's kind of a hint. We're going to have to go down the list a little ways here, so you might want to go ahead and jump down the list further. 2 times 180, 3 times 120, 4 times 90. These are 86 apart, still much too far apart. 5 times 72, 6 times 60. These are 54 apart, so we're getting closer. 7 won't go into 360, but 8 will. 8 times 45. Those are 37 apart, and so those are the numbers we want. Now the larger number, 45, takes the sign of b, which is positive, so the 8 becomes a negative 8. So we form our box, and we have 5x squared and negative 72, and then a negative 8x, and again, I'll put it here this time just so you know it works either way, and 45x here. So going across the top row, 5x squared, 45x, we can factor out a 5x. Negative 8x, negative 72, 8 will go into both of those, and it's a negative 8 because that term, the box closest to the term that we're writing is negative. 5x squared and negative 8x, we can factor out an x. 45x and negative 72, we can factor out a 9. So we end up with, remember that number that we had factored out, 3 times x plus 9 times 5x minus 8. And you can leave it just like that. Okay, number 6, now we're going to solve an equation using our factoring. So notice that we have a quadratic, we have an x squared term. Generally speaking, we want everything over to one side. So we start with negative 16x plus 8x equals negative 24. I'm going to move the 24 over by adding 24 to undo the negative. So now we have negative 16x squared plus 8x plus 24 equals 0. So we have a quadratic set equal to 0. That's good. Now let's see if we can factor this. Well, now notice 8 will go into all three of these terms. So we can factor out an 8, and we want this leading coefficient to be positive, so I'm going to factor out a negative 8. So negative 16x squared divided by negative 8 gives us a positive 2x squared, and then we get negative x, and then 24 divided by negative 8, negative 3. Alright, and now we can divide each side by negative 8. So now we get a nice simple trinomial of 2x squared minus x minus 3, and 0 divided by negative 8 is still 0. Okay, so now we can try to factor this out. So we have a times c. 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. The value of b is negative 1. So we have opposite signs, two numbers that multiply to 6 that have a difference of 1. And that will be 2 and 3. The larger of the two numbers, 3, has to take the sign of b. So it becomes a negative 3. So now we can write our box. Let's see, I'll put it over here this time. And we have 2x squared and negative 3. And then we have a 2x and a negative 3x. Okay, so 2x squared, 2x, greatest common factor is 2x. Negative 3x and negative 3, greatest common factor. We have a negative 3. Remember, it takes the sign here. 2x squared and negative 3x, we can only factor out x. And then 2x and negative 3, we can only factor out a 1. So now we end up with x plus 1 times 2x minus 3 is equal to 0. So now we have a product equal to 0, which means one of the factors has to be 0. So either x plus 1 equals 0 or 2x minus 3 equals 0. Subtract 1 from each side to get x equals negative 1. Add 3 and divide by 2 to get x equals 3 halves. Alright, so there you go, and good luck with factoring your trinomials where the leading coefficient is not 1.